A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you so much for tuning into another edition of Bearing Arms' Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. I'm glad to be with you today. Obviously, it is a very sad day across this nation as America still mourns the loss of lives in El Paso, Texas, in Dayton, Ohio over the weekend. 29 people dead in those two attacks. And we have seen no shortage of calls for all kinds of gun control. Democrat presidential candidates like Kamala Harris calling for quote-unquote assault bans. Others calling for quote-unquote universal background checks. Even saw some Republicans and folks who are known to be pro-gun getting in on the action as well. Representative Dan Crenshaw on Twitter last night talking about red flag laws. President Trump earlier this morning on Twitter referenced quote, tougher background checks, but in his comments to the nation, he did not mention background checks. Instead, he brought up red flag firearm laws. So, first of all, I want to let you know that over the course of the next week or two, or however long it takes, we're going to be talking about these issues. Whether it's universal background checks, red flag laws, gun bans, gun licensing, any of the gun control proposals that have been put forward. We'll also be talking with stakeholders, folks from the mental health community, law enforcement, public officials, about what we can do that will really address this issue. Because, and it's not even one issue, because when we talk about quote unquote gun violence, we're talking about several different issues. And they may have, in fact, I think they do have different strategies that we can use to be most effective. So suicide, gang violence, domestic violence, these mass killings, all of these incidents may involve a firearm. They may not involve a firearm, but they're all separate acts of violence. And how we address each and every one of those types of violence, I think, is really important. The president talked about red flag laws today. The president, by the way, talked about a lot of things that he would like to see his administration do, starting with something that I think really would be effective, and that is identifying these individuals before they have the opportunity to commit mass murder. We have heard from the Secret Service their latest report on attacks in public attacks, and virtually every one of those individuals exhibited warning signs that were either picked up by family, friends. Individuals could have seen these warning signs online in their social media postings. There was just a story out of Lubbock, Texas over the weekend, a young man who apparently had plans to kill as many people as possible at a motel. He mentioned something about this to his grandmother, and his grandmother contacted police. They were able to take this individual into custody before anybody was hurt. So ways that we can identify those individuals, be it us as family members or friends or law enforcement, that is something that I think actually would be very, very productive and very useful. The president also talked about a culture of violence that we live in here, a culture that celebrates and glorifies violence, including violent video games. And as I mentioned, the president also talked about these red flag laws, which he said he would be supportive of, particularly if there is strong due process. That's a big concern. So I'll give you a little bit of background about how these red flag firearms laws are supposed to work. Basically, if you see somebody that you believe is a threat to themselves, maybe a threat to others, depending on the state that you live in, because these are state level laws that we're talking about, you can go and petition a court. If you're a family member, some states you might even be able to be a coworker or a teacher, but you can say, hey, I think that person over there is a danger. And the judge will listen to what you have to say and either determine, yeah, I think you're right. Let's go ahead and sign this order here and we'll take their guns away. Or the judge can say, you know what, I just don't see it, so I'm not going to grant this order. Once the order has been granted, then the legally owned firearms that that individual may own are taken for a period of time. And again, it varies from state to state. Where those firearms go varies depending on state to state. But in most states, the guns are taken. In fact, in almost every state, I believe Maine might be the sole exception to this. But in every red flag law that I've seen, once the guns are taken, once the guns are removed, that's the end of the story. This is a gun control bill, not a mental health bill. And it was made crystal clear to Jim Wallace, the executive director of the Gun Owners Action League in the state of Massachusetts, that is exactly what these red flag laws were intended, not to address mental health concerns, but to deal with any sort of legal gun ownership. And that's where the law stopped. Massachusetts passed their red flag law last year. Jim Wallace joined me today to talk about what the bill looked like going through the legislative process, how it works in practice, and why Jim Wallace and gun owners across the state of Massachusetts are still not on board. So, Jim, obviously red flag firearm laws are in the news a lot. President Trump mentioned them earlier today, said that was one area that he would like to see Congress work on. You in Massachusetts, you all have a quote-unquote red flag law on the books, right?
Yeah, that got passed in the last legislative session last year, and it was quite a big push from the Moms Demand Action and a few other groups. It was actually very sad to watch the process because we were pretty much left out of the process. One of the things that we continue to push every time these mass shootings happen is mental health issues. And it was amazing to me when people start talking about we need to pass the red flag bills because we need to identify people who are mentally ill and may be a threat to themselves or others. But then they don't want to talk about mental health. And that was so amazing to us when they passed this bill because we had all kinds of amendments lined up for the bill, including setting up a commission to study the needs of mental health in Massachusetts. What are you going to do with these people once you identify them? Are you providing them help? Are you providing them services? All of these things. And literally 2 days before the bill hit the House floor for a debate, they changed the title to actually take out any mention of mental health. And then the night of the debate, with all of our amendments lined up, ready to go, the House Chair of Public Safety got up before the debate started and announced that this is not a mental health bill. This is a gun licensing bill. So we will not be considering any amendments that have to do with mental health. Well, how in the world is that possible? You're actually telling us that you want to identify people with mental health issues, but you're also telling us you don't want to deal with mental health. That, to me, is just so absurd. Cam, I mean, how do you explain it?
And that is one of the big concerns that I have with the red flag laws that I've seen introduced around the country is that it does seem to be a gun control answer to a mental health problem. And the fact that you had lawmakers say, we're not going to talk about mental health. So in Massachusetts, I want to make sure that I understand that this is how it works. Somebody who's subjected to one of these red flag firearms laws, if they're deemed by a court to be a danger to themselves or others, law enforcement will come and take any legally owned firearms that they might own, and then they'll leave them alone. And that's it.
And that's the questions we ask, because if you look at the two, I guess, paths that they look at is one, are you suicidal? Or number two, are you a potential mass killer? And on both issues, we said, okay, let's say somebody you think is potentially suicidal. You're going to drag them through a court process, make their problems public, probably exacerbate their mental health issues, and then take their guns and send them home with no help. So have you done harm or have you done good? And I say you've done harm. Now, on the other avenue, if we believe that you're a mass killer, once again, we drag you through court, probably make you more angry, take your legal guns away, and send you home. But wait a minute. Can you teach in a school? Can you be a truck driver? Can you be a doctor? I mean, how many different things do we need to look at? And it's so funny because when we started to talk about that, then the proponents of the bill said, well, you can't take away somebody's right to work. Well, wait a minute. You just said he's a potential mass killer. Why are we worried about how he's making a living? So as far as I'm concerned, Cam, the red flag laws are just a hoax. and they're talking around the problem rather than getting involved in the problem.
What about due process under the Massachusetts law? I know in a lot of states, the petitioner, whether it's a family member, some states it can be a coworker or a teacher, they go to the authorities. They say, listen, I think someone is dangerous either to themselves or others. There is a court hearing. That individual is not involved in that court hearing. If a judge rules that, I think this person is a danger to themselves or others, the red flag firearms law is then granted. And then at some later date, it might be just a week or two, but it's still a later date. That's when that individual gets a chance to respond in court. Is that how it works in Massachusetts?
Yeah, there's kind of a two-tiered approach in the Mass law. One is the emergency order, where somebody believes you're an imminent threat to yourself or others, and they can file a petition with the court under an emergency order. And if the judge then does grant the emergency order, then up to 10 days later, you have the right to go before a judge and plead your case. Interestingly enough, if you happen to be a law enforcement officer, that timeline is quicker. But what we have found in the emergency orders, or rather the orders that have been filed, all of them are so-called emergency orders. Now, here's a real bad sticking point, too, is that if you try to appeal one of these decisions, you not only lose possession of your guns, but you lose ownership of your guns. So what does that mean? Because I appeal something, that I actually lose ownership of my property? And the other problem is in Massachusetts, they've created what's called bonded warehouses, where once your guns are confiscated, they are then given usually to a bonded warehouse that's owned by a private person and starts charging you fees right away. So before you even know what's going on and before you even get to appeal your case, you're already in debt to somebody that you never authorized.
Unbelievable. Is there any appetite to try to reform this measure, to try to deal with some of the problems that you've talked about, or have lawmakers moved on since they made this law?
Well, I think they've moved on, and the problem is they've moved on to the point where, again, they don't want to deal with the mental health issue. I had a couple legislators told me that, Jim, if we tried to deal with the mental health issue, the needs of mental health in Mass, it would make the big dig look like a picnic. And, that was a $20 billion project. So that tells you why they don't want to talk about it, because if they actually had to deal with the mental health issues, then it would probably cost us, the state, a lot of money. But I mean, even to the point where one of our amendments was simply to set up a commission to actually work and tell us what we need in Massachusetts as far as mental health. Do we need outpatient, inpatient beds, so on and so on. And we couldn't even get them to form that commission. So that tells you how much they do not want to talk about mental health, even though they want to take guns away from people that have mental health issues.
Jim Wallace, Executive Director of the Gun Owners Action League. I appreciate the insight, sir. Thank you so much for your time, and hope we get a chance to talk again soon. And again, throughout the week here on Bearing Arms Cam and Company, we are going to be talking with folks with firsthand experience with some of these gun control proposals, but we're going to get beyond just what we think doesn't work. We are going to be talking about what does work. It is clear that there is a great desire across this country to do something in the wakes of these violent attacks. I think it's incredibly important that we don't just do something, but that we do something that actually works. Now, let's get to today's Armed Citizen story, our good deed of the day, and of course, a look at the problems in the existing criminal justice system, which politicians don't really seem to want to actually talk about. In fact, that's where we'll get started from the state of Maryland, which has, again, all kinds of gun control laws on the books. Back in 2013, the state of Maryland adopted what is known as the Maryland Firearms Safety Act. This was sweeping gun control legislation. Gun control advocates really got everything that they wanted since then. In Baltimore, homicide rate has climbed to historic high levels, and as it turns out, criminals still seem to be able to get a hold of guns if they want. So this is from the Capital Gazette in Annapolis, Maryland. Man charged in Curtis Bay shooting had a basement arsenal. So this is an individual who was, again, suspected or is a suspect in a shooting in Severn, Maryland, or Curtis Bay, Maryland, grazing one man's head in a drug deal gone awry. That's how the press discovers it. When they made an arrest, they searched this guy's home. They found what the Gazette is calling a quote, arsenal of firearms there in the basement of the home. They found some drugs. They found some pills. They found a scale. Quote, numerous boxes and containers used for the packaging and distribution of drugs. They found about $7,000 in cash, as well as 11 firearms, 6 handguns, 2 shotguns, 2 rifles, and a revolver. Not what I would consider to be an arsenal, but none of the 11 firearms this individual was allowed to legally own because he's a convicted felon. Yeah, as it turns out, just last year, the suspect in this case pleaded guilty to having a handgun in a vehicle. Now, what's interesting to note is that was not what the original charge was. According to the Capital Gazette, prosecutors dropped 3 other gun-related charges, more serious gun-related charges, and in exchange, he was allowed to plead guilty to having a gun in a vehicle. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. The Capital Gazette says a judge suspended his entire 2-year jail term, instead sentencing him to 1 year of supervised probation. Now, the guy faces 19 counts, stemming from his most recent arrest, as well as a separate probation violation. But if this individual had been had the law actually applied to him the first go around, he probably wouldn't be facing charges related to his shooting, probably wouldn't be facing drug charges, probably wouldn't be facing a whole host of other gun-related charges because he would have been behind bars. But even with all of these sweeping gun control laws on the books in the state of Maryland, they're not applied. If they are applied, oftentimes how they're applied is that they are used as a plea bargaining tool. And so instead of the more serious charges, you get to plead guilty to one of these new gun control laws that doesn't carry with it as stiff a sentence, and then whoof, you're sent on your merry way. In Colorado, Commerce City, Colorado, a woman defending herself from a knife-wielding robber. I love that headline, who then flees. Yeah, it's what happens when you bring a knife to a gunfight, isn't it? So this was actually late Sunday morning, according to Commerce City, Colorado police, about 11:30 a.m. in the Aspen Hills condominium complex. When officers arrived on scene, they met a woman who said she was a realtor who was conducting an open house at one of the homes there. She said that a guy in his late 20s or early 30s came in, threatened her with a knife, and demanded that she give him some of what she had, some of her possessions. The woman then retrieved a handgun, fired one shot at the suspect. Unknown, according to police, whether or not the suspect was struck. He did take off in an unknown direction. The woman was taken to a local hospital for treatment of injuries, not life-threatening injuries, thankfully, but apparently she was hurt. In this altercation, officers searched the area, unable to find the suspect. We'll keep our eyes on that story and bring you any developments as they become available. And finally, our good deed of the day from Washington State, a story that hits close to home. You know, we do this program each and every day from Farmville, Virginia. This is a farming community, a very rural part of the state of Virginia. My wife is fighting stage 4 cancer as well. So these two headlines, or this headline, combining those two things, really struck home. Ritzville, Washington. There's a gentleman there in Ritzville, Washington, who is fighting stage 4 melanoma. Larry Yockey's his name. He's a 4th-generation farmer. He's got about 1,200 acres. And Larry needed to bring in the wheat harvest. And Larry was going to have some trouble because of the cancer that he is fighting. His daughter, Amanda Yockey, says that the community really came together. She says, you don't have to plan that your dad's going to have to retire early on something that he's been doing since 1988. Well, again, friends, neighbors, even strangers came together all to help harvest Larry Yockey's 1,200 acres. He said what normally they're going to do in about 2/3 of a day, he said it would take me about 3 weeks to cut it if I did all of that by myself. He said, it's an amazing thing. His daughter Amanda said, words cannot describe what this community has done for my family. Larry says, they are my community. And indeed they are. So in the right place at the right time and willing and able to help out a neighbor. We thank the good folks there in Ritzville, Washington for their good deed. That is, unfortunately, all the time that we have for you on this edition of Bearing Arms' Cam and Company. I do want to let you know, though, again, we will be back tomorrow and all week long with the latest Second Amendment news and information. And I would encourage you very strongly this week to go ahead, contact your state senators, contact your state representatives, contact your U.S. senators as well, and your federal member of Congress, your federal representative. Gun control advocates are certainly going to be doing the same thing. They're going to be mobilizing their supporters. It is very important that your elected officials hear from you. And, of course, for all of the latest Second Amendment news and information each and every day, be sure to check out bearingarms.com. Thanks again for being a part of the program. We will see you back here tomorrow.